The morning of December 23rd, 1944, near the Belgian town of Mannheim, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Becker crouched inside the cramped fighting compartment of his Panther tank, watching through his periscope as American Sherman tanks maneuvered through the snow-covered forest ahead. His crew had been fighting for 3 days straight in the opening phase of what the Allies would call the Battle of the Bulge, and exhaustion pressed against his temples like a physical weight. But it wasn't fatigue that made his hands tremble as he adjusted his vision blocks. It was the realization that had been slowly, terribly dawning on him since their unit had overrun an American armored position 2 days earlier. A realization about the 5 dead Americans they'd found inside a knocked-out Sherman, and what that 5th body meant. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Becker had commanded Panzers since 1942, first in North Africa, then on the Eastern Front, and now here in the Ardennes. He'd been trained at Paderborn, where instructors had drilled into him and his comrades the superiority of German armored doctrine, the efficiency of German engineering, the precision of German tactics, the intellectual sophistication that made Wehrmacht panzer crews the finest in the world. They'd studied the American Sherman with something approaching contempt. It was a crude machine, they'd been told, mass-produced by a nation that understood manufacturing, but not war. The Americans built tanks the way they built automobiles, quickly, cheaply, and in overwhelming numbers, compensating for individual inferiority with industrial excess. But now, as Becker's gunner called out range estimates and his loader stood ready beside the 75mm main gun, he couldn't stop thinking about that 5th American corpse. The Panther, like every German tank Becker had ever crewed, operated with 5 men, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator, who also manned the whole machine gun. This was the standard configuration, refined through years of combat experience, representing what German doctrine considered the optimal balance between fighting efficiency and crew size. The Americans, he'd been taught, used the same basic arrangement in their Shermans, perhaps with slightly different task distributions, but fundamentally similar. Except they didn't. Not really. And the difference, Becker was beginning to understand, revealed something far more disturbing than a simple variation in crew assignment. The discovery had come in the chaos after their company had punched through American lines south of Stavelot. They had knocked out 3 Shermans in quick succession, their long-barreled guns making short work of the American tanks' thinner armor. Standard procedure required checking the wrecks for intelligence, maps, radio, codes, anything useful. Becker had approached one of the burning Shermans cautiously, covering his nose against the acrid smell of burning rubber and diesel fuel. The turret hatch stood open, blown outward by the force of the penetration that had killed the crew. Inside he'd counted 5 bodies. At first, he'd assumed one was an officer or passenger, someone catching a ride, perhaps, or a mechanic. But then he'd noticed the positions. One in the commander's cupola, one at the gunner's station, one clearly the loader based on the 75mm rounds scattered around him, and 2 in the hull, the driver in his seat on the left, and another man in the right hull position, slumped over a .30 caliber machine gun. 5 assigned crew stations, 5 men who'd trained together, fought together, died together. Becker's radio operator, Schütze Weber, had been the one to voice what they were all thinking. Herr Oberfeldwebel, he'd said quietly, why do they need 5? Weber was 19, fresh from training, replacing the radio operator they'd lost outside Aachen. He'd been with the crew for only 3 weeks, and Becker could hear in his voice the same confusion he himself felt. Everything in their training had emphasized efficiency, the elegant minimalism of German doctrine. 5 crew members represented the optimized solution. Adding a sixth would mean wasted space, wasted training resources, unnecessary complexity. But the Americans didn't have a sixth crew member. They had 5, same as the Germans. So why had German doctrine always implied the Americans somehow operated their tanks with less sophistication, less elegance? The answer, Becker had realized with growing unease over the following 2 days of combat, wasn't about the number. It was about what the Americans did with their 5 crew members that differed so fundamentally from German practice. And more disturbingly, it was about what that difference revealed about American thinking, about how the United States approached the mathematics of industrial war in ways that German planners either hadn't considered or had deliberately chosen to ignore. To understand what troubled Becker that December morning, you have to understand what he'd been taught, what every German tanker learned at places like Paderborn or Erlangen or Munster, where the Wehrmacht trained its armored forces. German tank doctrine in 1944 represented the culmination of nearly a decade of theoretical development and practical combat experience. It drew on lessons from the Spanish Civil War, the Polish campaign, the breakthrough at Sedan in 1940, and the vast armored battles on the Eastern Front. At its core was a philosophy that emphasized the tank as a precision instrument, a carefully engineered weapons system where every component, including the human crew, functioned with mechanical exactitude. The standard German tank crew configuration reflected this philosophy. In a Panzer IV, Panther or Tiger, the commander occupied the cupola on the right side of the turret, elevated above the other crew members, where he could survey the battlefield through multiple vision blocks and a scissor periscope. His job was pure command: identify targets, direct the gunner, coordinate with other tanks via radio, make tactical decisions. He didn't load shells or drive the tank or maintain the radio. He commanded. Below him sat the gunner, positioned to the right of the main gun, eyes pressed to the telescopic sight, hands on the elevation and traverse controls. The gunner's world narrowed to the circle of glass through which he viewed the enemy, making minute adjustments to put rounds on target. This was a specialized skill requiring hundreds of hours of training to master the geometry of trajectory, the timing of moving targets, the compensation for wind and temperature, and the specific ballistics of different ammunition types. To the left of the gun stood the loader, whose task seemed simple but demanded both physical strength and perfect timing. A 75mm shell for a Panther weighed approximately 15 pounds. In combat, a good loader could maintain a rate of fire of 8 to 10 rounds per minute, swinging these heavy shells from the ready racks, ramming them into the breech, stepping clear as the gun recoiled, then immediately reaching for the next round. This was exhausting work, made more brutal by the confined space, the gun recoiling violently inches from your face, the spent shell casings clattering around your feet, the acrid propellant smoke burning your throat and eyes. Down in the hole sat the driver, left side, controlling the tank's movement through a complex system of gears, clutches, and steering levers that required constant attention and considerable physical strength. Panzer transmissions were sophisticated but temperamental, and a skilled driver could mean the difference between reaching a position in time or breaking down kilometers short. The driver saw the world through a narrow vision slit, navigating by verbal instructions from the commander, feeling the terrain through the tank's response to his controls. And finally, the radio operator, positioned in the right hull, maintaining communication with company headquarters, other tanks in the platoon, and sometimes with infantry or artillery units operating nearby. He also manned the hull-mounted machine gun, the 7.92mm MG-34 for close defense against infantry. This dual role, communications and defensive armament, made efficient use of available crew space and kept the radio operator engaged during combat rather than sitting idle. 5 men, 5 specialized roles. German training emphasized that each crew member should perfect his specific function. Cross-training existed, certainly. If the commander was killed, the gunner might take over. If the driver was wounded, the radio operator might try to get the tank moving. But these were emergency expedients, not standard practice. The ideal German tank crew functioned like a fine watch, each component performing its designated task with practiced precision. This approach produced crews of remarkable technical proficiency. After months of training and combat experience, a veteran German tank crew could operate with extraordinary coordination. The commander's target identification flowed seamlessly into the gunner's aim and the loader's ammunition selection. The driver anticipated the commander's movement orders, shifting position even before the command was fully articulated. The radio operator maintained the tactical picture, feeding information to the commander while keeping the hull gun ready for close threats. But this specialization came with costs that German doctrine accepted as the price of efficiency. Each crew member became highly adapted to his specific role and less capable in others. The system worked beautifully when all 5 men were present, experienced, and functioning well. It worked less beautifully when men were tired or green or dead. Klaus Becker had experienced this reality firsthand over 2 years of combat. He'd lost his original driver to a Russian anti-tank rifle outside Kursk in the summer of 1943. The radio operator had slid into the driver's seat, but the man had perhaps 20 hours of actual driving practice, most of it from training years earlier. For 2 weeks, until a replacement driver arrived, their Panzer had lurched and stalled, the inexperienced driver grinding gears and misjudging terrain. Their combat effectiveness had dropped noticeably. The radio operator couldn't drive the tank competently and monitor communications and man the hull gun simultaneously. Something had to give, and usually it was the radio watch and the hull gun that went unattended. He'd lost loaders to exhaustion, their arms simply giving out after hours of continuous combat, reduced to fumbling shells with shaking hands, rate of fire dropping from 8 rounds per minute to 4 or 5. He'd seen gunners with eyes so strained from hours at the sight that they could barely focus, missing shots they would have made easily when fresh. He'd watched his driver, after 16 hours of straight at the controls during the retreat from Kharkov, become so fatigued that Becker had finally ordered him to switch with the radio operator just so the man could rest his arms and shoulders for an hour, even though this meant their already exhausted radio operator had to take over driving duties he wasn't truly qualified for. German doctrine had answers for these problems, of course. Crews were supposed to be rotated out of the line for rest. Replacement personnel were supposed to arrive trained and ready. But by late 1944, these theoretical solutions increasingly failed to match battlefield reality. The Wehrmacht was stretched thin across multiple fronts. Replacement pipelines were disrupted by Allied bombing, and training time had been progressively shortened as losses mounted and the need for warm bodies grew more desperate. Becker's current radio operator, young Weber, represented this degradation perfectly. He'd received perhaps 8 weeks of training total, enough to learn basic radio procedures and how to load and fire the whole machine gun, but nowhere near the 6 months that Becker's first radio operator had received back in 1942. Weber could handle routine communications, and he didn't panic under fire, which made him better than some replacements Becker had seen. But he couldn't perform maintenance on the radio equipment, didn't really understand the tactical situation well enough to filter relevant information effectively, and his machine gun marksmanship was merely adequate. He was a warm body filling a necessary slot, doing his best, but not the thoroughly trained specialist that German doctrine assumed would occupy that position. And this, Becker was realizing, was where the Americans had made a choice that German planners apparently hadn't even considered as an option. The Sherman tank's crew configuration looked similar on paper to the German arrangement. Commander in the turret cupola, gunner at the gun sight, loader handling ammunition, driver controlling the tank's movement, and a fifth man in the right hull position. But that fifth man, the assistant driver, as American manuals called him, or bow gunner, as the crews themselves often said, represented a fundamentally different philosophy about how a tank crew should function. Becker had found an American manual in the wreckage of a command half-track 2 days ago, before they'd been forced to withdraw from their advanced positions. It was a training document, oil-stained and dog-eared, titled FM 17-12 Tank Gunnery. He'd studied it by flashlight that night while his crew slept, puzzling through the English with help from a German-English dictionary he'd carried since North Africa, where captured British documents had often proved useful. What he'd read had disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. The American assistant driver was trained not just to man the bow machine gun and navigate for the driver, but to actually drive the tank himself, not as an emergency backup, but as a fully qualified alternate driver. American training doctrine called for the assistant driver and driver to switch positions regularly during long movements, preventing the kind of exhaustion that Becker had seen disable his own drivers. The manual even specified intervals. On road marches exceeding 4 hours, drivers should rotate every 2 hours. In combat, if the primary driver was wounded or killed, the assistant driver could take over with no loss of capability. But it went beyond just driving. The manual described cross-training throughout the crew. Loaders were trained on the gunner's position. Gunners received basic instruction in commanding. The assistant driver learned basic radio operation. Even the tank commander was expected to be able to perform any crew position if necessary. The goal, the manual stated explicitly, was crew redundancy and operational sustainability during extended combat operations. Crew redundancy. The phrase had stuck in Becker's mind like a burr. It seemed so wasteful, so American. Why train a man to perform multiple roles when specialization produced better performance in each individual task? Why dedicate training time to teaching a loader how to aim the gun when that time could be spent making him faster and more efficient at loading? But sitting in his Panther now, watching those Shermans maneuver through the forest with a coordination that suggested fresh, alert crews despite days of continuous combat, Becker understood the answer. And it made his stomach tight with an anxiety that had nothing to do with the immediate tactical situation. The Americans could sustain operations longer because their crews could rest in rotation. When one driver grew tired, another took over. Not an exhausted radio operator pressed into emergency service, but a man trained specifically to drive, taking his regular turn at the controls. When a loader's arms began to fail after hours of handling heavy shells, he could potentially switch with the assistant driver, or even the gunner for a period, sharing the physical burden. More critically, when casualties occurred, American crews could absorb them better. If a Sherman's loader was killed, the assistant driver could move up to the turret. He'd trained on the position, knew the ammunition types, understood the loading sequence. The bow gun would go unmanned, yes, but the main gun would keep firing. If the gunner died, the loader could take over gunning duties while the assistant driver became the loader. The tank remained combat effective with only 4 men, or even 3, because each crew member had been trained to perform multiple roles. German tanks, with their specialized crews, degraded more sharply when men were lost. Becker had seen it happen repeatedly. A Panther with a dead loader might struggle along with the gunner loading his own gun. a process that cut the rate of fire by more than half and meant the gunner couldn't maintain constant watch through his sight. A Panzer IV with a wounded driver might crawl forward under the uncertain control of a radio operator who barely remembered his training. Combat effectiveness didn't degrade gracefully. It collapsed suddenly when key specialists were removed. But the implications went deeper than just tactical flexibility, and this was what truly troubled Becker as he watched those Shermans. What he was seeing wasn't just a different crew configuration. It was evidence of a fundamentally different understanding of industrial warfare, one that the Wehrmacht's doctrine seemed not to have grasped. The German approach to armored warfare emphasized quality over quantity, sophistication over simplicity, specialized excellence over general competence. This made sense for a nation with Germany's resource constraints. Germany couldn't match the Soviet Union in tank numbers, couldn't compete with American industrial output. So German doctrine sought advantage through superior technology, better training, more refined tactics. Build better tanks, train better crews, fight more intelligently. Make every Panther worth 3 Shermans, every Tiger worth 5. And on a pure technical level, this worked. The Panther's 75mm gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor at 2,000 meters. The Sherman's 75mm gun often couldn't penetrate a Panther's frontal armor even at point-blank range, except with the newer, scarce armor-piercing ammunition. On paper, in the clean mathematics of armor thickness and penetration values, the Panther was objectively superior. But those 5-man American crews, with their cross-training and redundancy and emphasis on sustained operations, revealed a different kind of sophistication. One focused not on the capabilities of individual tanks, but on the aggregate effectiveness of armored formations over extended campaigns. The Americans had apparently decided that the goal wasn't to build the perfect tank crew, but to build a crew system that could maintain operational tempo despite casualties, fatigue, and the inevitable friction of combat. This required a kind of industrial abundance that Germany simply didn't possess. Training every American tank crew member to perform multiple roles meant longer training cycles and more resources devoted to crew preparation. It meant accepting that individual crew members might not be quite as specialized, quite as precisely efficient at their primary roles. A Sherman loader who'd also trained on gunnery and driving might not be quite as fast at loading as a German loader who'd focused exclusively on that single task. But the American system assumed you could afford that slight loss of individual efficiency because you had resources Germany lacked, time to train crews more thoroughly, fuel to run extended training exercises, enough tanks to rotate units out of combat for rest and refit, and, most critically, enough replacement tanks and crews that you could sustain losses that would cripple a German Panzer division. Becker had seen the evidence of this overwhelming material superiority at every level. When his company had overrun that American supply dump near Stavelot, they'd found stacks of jerry cans filled with fuel, more gasoline in one location than Becker's entire battalion had received in the previous month. They'd found crates of rations, medical supplies, spare parts, ammunition in quantities that seemed almost obscene. His men had gorged themselves on American chocolate and canned meat, stuffing their pockets with cigarettes and tinned coffee. And everywhere they'd found spare tank parts, complete engines, still in their crates, transmissions, track sections, enough components to rebuild dozens of Shermans from scratch. The abundance was staggering, almost offensive in its excess. German maintenance crews performed miracles keeping damaged Panthers running with cannibalized parts and field expedients. American maintenance crews, apparently, just swapped out entire engine assemblies when something broke. This same industrial philosophy, Becker now understood, extended to crew training and configuration. The Americans could afford to train every crew member to perform multiple roles because they had the resources for extended training programs. They could afford to emphasize crew endurance and redundancy because they had enough tanks and crews that losing one didn't cripple a unit. They could accept slightly lower individual efficiency in exchange for sustained collective effectiveness because their industrial base could produce enough tanks to compensate. Germany couldn't match this approach, even if German planners had wanted to. The Wehrmacht was perpetually short of fuel, training time, replacement equipment, and replacement personnel. Training had to be abbreviated to push bodies to the front. Specialization made sense when you couldn't afford lengthy cross-training programs. You taught each man one job, taught him thoroughly and quickly, and sent him forward to fill a specific slot in the machine. But this efficiency came at a terrible cost in sustained operations, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the Ardennes offensive now underway. Hitler's plan called for German forces to drive through the American lines, seize bridges across the Meuse River, and push on to Antwerp, cutting off Allied armies in Belgium and Holland. It was an ambitious operation requiring sustained momentum, rapid exploitation of breakthroughs, and the kind of operational tempo that German Panzer divisions had demonstrated in France in 1940 and Russia in 1941. Except those earlier campaigns had been fought by crews with months of training and adequate rest. The Panzer crews in the Ardennes in December 1944 were exhausted before the offensive even began. Becker's company had been rushed from the Siegfried Line with barely a week to refit. Most crews were under strength, filled out with hastily trained replacements like young Weber. The promised fuel supplies were already running short. His Panther had perhaps 80 kilometers of range remaining, and no one could tell him when the next fuel delivery would arrive. And they were fighting American units whose material abundance allowed a completely different operational rhythm. Those Sherman crews Becker was watching had probably been rotated out of combat several times already during the last month, rested, resupplied, brought back to strength with fresh personnel. Their tanks had been maintained properly, not patched together with improvised repairs. Their fuel tanks were full. They'd eaten hot meals and slept in heated quarters and received mail from home. Meanwhile, Becker's crew had been eating cold rations for 3 days, sleeping in the tank when they slept at all, and rationing fuel carefully because they couldn't be sure when more would arrive. Weber was operating on perhaps 4 hours of sleep in the last 48 hours. Their loader, Gefreiter Schultz, had strained his back hoisting shells during the engagement near Stavelot, and was functioning at maybe 70% capacity, grimacing with pain each time he lifted a round to the breech. Their driver, Unteroffizier Hartmann, was the most experienced man in the crew after Becker himself, but even Hartmann was showing signs of fatigue. Slower reactions, minor mistakes in gear selection, the 1,000-yard stare of a man pushed too far for too long. If this were an American crew, Becker thought, they could rotate the drivers, share the loading duties, distribute the burden of continuous operations. But they were German, trained in the precise doctrine of specialization, and that meant each man had to perform his specific role until he literally couldn't continue. There was no redundancy, no backup, no capacity to share the load. The irony was bitter enough to taste. German propaganda had spent years mocking American industrial methods, the assembly line mentality, the mass production of adequate rather than excellent equipment, the emphasis on quantity over quality. Becker himself had absorbed these messages, had believed them to some degree. The Americans were rich but unimaginative, capable of flooding the battlefield with mediocre equipment but lacking the martial spirit and technical sophistication of German forces. But what he was seeing now suggested something far different. The Americans hadn't simply thrown money and resources at the problem of armored warfare. They'd thought systematically about how to sustain combat operations over extended campaigns, how to absorb casualties without catastrophic degradation of capability, how to keep crews effective when exhaustion and attrition took their inevitable toll. The 5-man Sherman crew, with its cross-training and redundancy, wasn't a sign of wasteful excess. It was elegant design for a different purpose. Not the perfect execution of a single battle, but the sustained prosecution of a long industrial war. And that design assumed something even more disturbing, that America could afford to lose tanks and crews at rates that would destroy a German Panzer division, then replace those losses and continue operations without pause. The extra training time, the redundant crew capabilities, the emphasis on sustained operations, all of it made sense only if you had the industrial capacity to treat tanks and even trained crews as expendable resources that could be continuously regenerated. Becker had seen this capacity demonstrated with his own eyes. 2 days ago, his company had destroyed 6 American Shermans in a successful ambush. Good shooting, textbook tactics, the kind of engagement where superior German training and equipment showed clear advantage. They'd felt a moment of grim satisfaction, the professional pride of soldiers who'd executed a difficult task well. Then yesterday, they'd encountered that same American unit again, and it had been back to full strength. 6 replacement Shermans, fresh crews or reassigned survivors, functioning as if the previous day's losses had never happened. The Americans had absorbed casualties that would have put a German company out of action for weeks, and they'd simply filled the gaps and continued fighting. How did you defeat an enemy like that? German tactical doctrine, German technical superiority, German fighting spirit. None of it mattered if the enemy could sustain losses indefinitely and keep coming. It was like fighting the tide. You might win individual engagements, might destroy more of their tanks than they destroyed of yours, might demonstrate superior skill and courage at every turn, but they would still be there tomorrow, and the next day and the day after that, with new tanks and fresh crews, while your own forces withered away through attrition that couldn't be replaced. This was the horrible understanding that had been growing in Becker's mind since that first moment of seeing 5 American bodies in a knocked-out Sherman. It wasn't about the crew configuration itself. It was about what that configuration represented. An entirely different approach to warfare, one that Germany couldn't match because it required resources Germany didn't possess. The Americans had built a military machine designed not for brilliant victories but for grinding, methodical, inevitable advance. They'd optimized for sustainability over elegance, for aggregate effect over individual excellence, for the long industrial campaign over the decisive battle. German doctrine had prepared its Panzer crews to fight like duelists, highly trained, precisely coordinated, seeking the perfect shot that would destroy the enemy before he could respond. American doctrine had prepared its tank crews to fight like industrial workers on a production line, each crew member trained to perform multiple tasks, the system designed to absorb damage and keep functioning, the whole apparatus backed by an industrial base that could replace losses faster than combat could inflict them. And in December 1944, in the forests of Belgium, it was becoming terribly clear which approach would prevail. Herr Oberfeldwebel, his gunner's voice crackled through the intercom, pulling Becker back to the immediate tactical situation. Range to nearest target, 1,000 meters. I have a clear shot at the lead Sherman. Becker pressed his eye to his periscope, evaluating the situation with the practiced speed of a veteran commander. 3 Shermans visible, moving in a loose formation through the trees. His Panther had superior position, hull down behind a low ridge, only the turret exposed. The long 75-millimeter gun could penetrate any Sherman at this range. Standard engagement, the kind his crew had executed dozens of times. "Wait," Becker ordered. continuing to scan the terrain. Something felt wrong. Those Shermans were moving too confidently, not with the caution of a unit probing for enemy positions. Either they didn't know his Panther was here, or movement to the left. More Shermans, at least 4, working around the flank. And there, barely visible through the trees to the right, another group. It wasn't a probe. It was a coordinated assault, multiple units moving in concert, and his single Panther was positioned exactly where they'd expected German armor to be. The Americans were learning. For 2 years, Becker had relied on German tactical superiority to offset American numerical advantage, but these Shermans weren't blundering into his kill zone. They were executing a competent flanking maneuver, using their numbers to force him into a position where his technical advantages wouldn't matter. He could kill the 3 tanks to his front, certainly. His gun, his gunner's skill, the Panther's armor, all superior. But while he engaged those 3, the flanking groups would maneuver into positions where they could hit his thinner side armor, 8 or 10 Shermans against 1 Panther. Even with his advantages, those weren't survivable odds. "Driver, reverse," Becker ordered, making the decision instantly. "Slowly. Keep us hulled down as long as possible. Gunner, stay on target, but do not fire unless I command." They'd have to withdraw, find a better position, maybe link up with the rest of the company. It was the tactically sound decision, the kind of fighting retreat that German doctrine emphasized. Preserve your force, trade space for time, avoid decisive engagement on unfavorable terms. But even as his driver began easing the Panther backward, Becker felt the weight of what that withdrawal represented. They were retreating from a superior force of technically inferior tanks. Not because German training or equipment had failed, but because the Americans simply had enough tanks, enough crews, enough material resources to overwhelm German tactical advantages through sheer mass and persistence. This was the nightmare that German planners had tried to avoid through technical sophistication and tactical excellence. But sophistication and excellence required resources, too. Fuel to train drivers properly, time to drill gunners to perfection, replacement personnel with adequate training, spare parts to keep vehicles operational. And those resources were bleeding away, while American resources seemed inexhaustible. The Panther's engine rumbled as Hartmann worked the controls, backing them carefully down the reverse slope. In the turret, Schultz stood ready at the ammunition racks, favoring his injured back, while Weber monitored the radio frequency for orders from company headquarters. The gunner kept his sight fixed on those lead Shermans, ready to fire if they detected the withdrawal and charged forward. 5 German specialists performing their assigned roles with practiced coordination. And somewhere in those Sherman tanks maneuvering through the forest, 5-man American crews were doing the same. But with the knowledge that if they lost men, others could take over. That if they grew exhausted from days of operations, they could rotate duties. That if their tank was destroyed, another would arrive tomorrow to replace it. Not because American crews were better trained or more courageous, but because the system they served had been designed from the ground up to sustain operations through whatever losses the enemy could inflict. Becker's radio crackled. "Lower 3, this is Lower Actual. What is your situation?" That was Hauptmann Dietz, the company commander. Becker keyed his microphone. "Lower Actual, Lower 3. Enemy armor in company strength executing flanking maneuver. Am withdrawing to secondary position. Request instructions." A pause. Then, "Lower 3. Withdraw to rally point Gustav. All units are pulling back. The offensive is stalling. Fuel situation critical. The offensive is stalling." 4 words that confirmed what Becker had been feeling for days now. The great gamble, the desperate lunge for Antwerp, was failing. Not because German soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because the operational design required a tempo that German logistics couldn't sustain. They needed to move fast, to reach the Meuse before American reinforcements arrived, to seize fuel dumps and supply depots to keep the advance going. But the promised fuel deliveries hadn't arrived. The captured American supplies had been less abundant than hoped, and the Americans were reacting faster than German intelligence had predicted. And of course the Americans were reacting faster. They had the fuel to move their reserves. They had the trucks to transport infantry. They had the radios and the telephone lines and the logistical apparatus to coordinate responses across hundreds of kilometers. They had, in short, all the boring industrial infrastructure that German propaganda had mocked as unsoldierly, but which turned out to matter enormously when you were trying to fight a mobile campaign in winter across difficult terrain. Acknowledged, love actual, Becker replied. Withdrawing now. His crew executed the withdrawal with professional competence. Hartmann kept the Panther moving smoothly backward, using the terrain to mask their movement. Weber maintained radio watch, monitoring for orders or warnings. Schultz stayed ready at the ammunition racks, and the gunner kept his sight trained on the most dangerous enemy avenue of approach. They worked together like the well-oiled machine German training intended them to be. But Becker couldn't shake the feeling that they were characters in a tragedy, executing their roles perfectly while the plot moved inexorably toward a predetermined conclusion. The Americans would keep coming. They'd take losses, certainly. Becker and crews like his would make sure of that. German guns would brew up Shermans by the dozen. German tactical skill would win engagement after engagement. But the Shermans would keep coming anyway, because behind them stood factories producing more tanks, training centers preparing more crews, ports unloading more fuel and ammunition and spare parts. An industrial avalanche that German excellence could delay but not stop. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The withdrawal to Rally Point Gustav took 40 minutes of careful maneuvering through forest trails that were barely wide enough for the Panther's 3.4-meter width. Hartmann drove with the skill of a veteran, reading the terrain through his narrow vision slit, feeling the tank's responses through the controls. But Becker could sense the exhaustion in even these precise movements, the slight hesitations, the occasional grinding of gears that wouldn't have happened if Hartmann were fresh. His driver had been at the controls almost continuously for 3 days, sleeping in his seat when he slept at all, and the strain was showing. An American crew could have rotated drivers, Becker thought, then forced the thought away. Dwelling on it wouldn't change their reality. Rally Point Gustav turned out to be a small clearing where what remained of the company was assembling. Becker counted 7 Panthers, including his own, down from the 14 they'd started with 4 days ago. Some had been knocked out in combat. Others had broken down and been abandoned when mechanical failures couldn't be repaired with available parts and time. One had simply run out of fuel 20 kilometers back and been left where it stopped. The crew redistributed to other tanks or sent back on foot. Hauptmann Dietz stood beside his command tank, studying a map spread across the engine deck. He looked up as Becker dismounted and approached, his face showing the same exhaustion Becker felt in his own bones. "Klaus," Dietz said quietly, using his first name, a familiarity that the situation seemed to permit. "Fuel situation." "Perhaps 60 kilometers range," Becker replied, "assuming we don't encounter significant combat." Dietz nodded, unsurprised. Same for most of the company. Division is supposed to be organizing a fuel convoy, but he gestured vaguely northward, where American artillery was audible in the distance. The Americans have the roads interdicted. They're flying ground attack missions despite the weather. Every supply column is being hit. "Orders, Herr Hauptmann." "We hold here for 6 hours. let the crews rest. Then we fall back to a defensive position near St. Vith. The offensive. Dietz paused, choosing his words carefully. The offensive is being reconsidered. Being reconsidered. That was one way to describe what was clearly becoming a catastrophic failure. The plan had called for German forces to reach the Meuse in 4 days. It was now day 4, and they were still east of the river, their advance stalled by American resistance that had proven far more effective than German intelligence had predicted. The soft American troops who were supposed to collapse under the initial assault had instead fought with unexpected determination. The fuel that was supposed to be captured from American dumps had been mostly destroyed by retreating units, and the weather that was supposed to ground Allied aircraft had lifted enough to allow fighter bombers to savage German supply columns. Becker had fought in enough failed operations to recognize the signs. The confident advance had become a cautious probing. Orders came slowly and often contradicted previous instructions. Units were asked to hold positions rather than exploit forward. The propaganda about imminent victory had given way to silence from headquarters. Permission to address the crew, Herr Hauptmann. They should eat and rest. Granted. We move out at 1900 hours. Becker returned to his Panther, where his crew had already begun the routine maintenance that kept their tank operational. Weber was checking the radio equipment. Schultz was inspecting the gun's recoil mechanism despite his injured back, and Hartmann had the engine deck open, examining the oil level and coolant system. They moved with the automatic precision of men who'd performed these tasks hundreds of times, finding problems before they became critical failures. "Gather round," Becker called. His crew assembled at the front of the tank, settling onto the glacis plate. He studied their faces. Weber young and frightened, but trying not to show it. Schultz older, experienced, dealing with pain through sheer stubbornness. Hartmann weathered and competent, but clearly exhausted. The gunner, Obergefreiter Meissner, maintaining the professional calm of a man who'd survived 2 years of Russian front combat by never allowing emotion to interfere with function. 6 hours rest, Becker told them. Then we withdraw to defensive positions. The offensive is stalling. Fuel and ammunition are short. The Americans are counterattacking in strength. He saw the information register on their faces, not surprise exactly, but a kind of grim confirmation of what they'd already suspected. Soldiers always knew when an operation was failing, even if no one officially told them. You could feel it in the tempo of orders, see it in the expressions of officers, sense it in the absence of the promised breakthrough that never materialized. "We've done our job," Becker continued. "This company has destroyed more than 20 American tanks in 4 days of combat. We've executed every order, held every position, made the Americans pay for every meter of ground. No one can question our performance." This was true as far as it went. His company had fought well by any reasonable standard. Their kill ratio against Sherman tanks was probably 3-to-1 or better. German training and equipment had proven their worth in engagement after engagement. But Becker could see in his crew's eyes that they understood what he wasn't saying. That fighting well wasn't enough anymore. That destroying 3 American tanks for every German loss was still losing when the Americans could replace their losses and Germany couldn't. That individual excellence didn't matter when you were drowning in an ocean of adequate competence backed by overwhelming material resources. "Get some food in you," he ordered. "Sleep if you can. Hartmann, you're off driving duty for the next 6 hours. I want you actually rested when we move out. Weber, you'll take first watch on the radio. Schultz, see if the medical officer has anything for your back. Meissner, check our ammunition status and report to Hauptmann Dietz. Dismissed." The crew dispersed to their tasks, and Becker found himself alone for the first time in days. He retrieved his own rations from the tank, cold sausage and hard bread, the last of his personal supply, and sat on the Panther's fender, chewing mechanically while his mind turned over the implications of what he'd witnessed. The American 5-man Sherman crew, with its cross-training and redundancy, was just one small piece of a much larger picture. But it was a revealing piece, a window into an entirely different philosophy of how to organize and sustain military forces in industrial warfare. The Americans, it seemed, had understood something that German planners had either missed or deliberately ignored. That in a long war of attrition, the side that could better sustain operations despite casualties and exhaustion would eventually prevail, regardless of individual technical superiority. This understanding manifested at every level of American military organization. Becker had noticed it first in small details during his time in North Africa, and then more extensively on the Western Front. American infantry squads carried more automatic weapons than German squads. Browning automatic rifles distributed liberally rather than concentrated in specialist machine gun teams. This made American squads less efficient in some tactical situations, but it also meant that losing 1 or 2 men didn't cripple the squad's firepower as dramatically. American artillery operated on principles of overwhelming volume rather than precise accuracy. German artillery doctrine emphasized careful observation, exact calculation, and minimal ammunition expenditure, putting shells precisely on target with mathematical efficiency. American artillery doctrine seemed to be, identify the general area, dump huge quantities of shells on it, and accept that this was wasteful but effective, and they had the shell production capacity to make this approach work. American logistics were redundant to a degree that struck German observers as almost comically excessive. Multiple supply routes to every major unit, spare parts stockpiled in quantities that assumed equipment would be replaced rather than repaired, medical facilities that could handle casualty rates German planners would consider catastrophic. All of it designed on the assumption that you could afford to be wasteful with material if it meant sustaining operations and preserving trained personnel. Even American command structures reflected this philosophy. German doctrine emphasized tight centralized control, with orders flowing down from higher headquarters and subordinate commanders expected to execute those orders precisely. This worked brilliantly when communications were intact and the situation developed as planned. It worked less well when things went wrong, and things always went wrong in combat. American doctrine seemed to grant subordinate commanders more latitude to adapt to changing circumstances, accepting a loss of operational elegance in exchange for better ability to respond to unexpected situations. All of these differences shared a common thread. The Americans had designed their military to be resilient rather than optimal, to sustain function despite disruption, rather than to execute perfect operations under ideal conditions. It was the difference between a Formula One race car and a farm tractor. The race car was faster, more sophisticated, more elegant in its engineering. But the tractor could keep working day after day in bad conditions, could be repaired by a competent mechanic rather than requiring a specialist, could absorb damage and keep functioning where the race car would be totaled by a single significant impact. Germany had built a Formula One military for a sprint race. America had built a tractor military for plowing a very large field. And the Second World War, it turned out, was a very large field indeed. Becker finished his meager meal and allowed himself to stretch out on the ground beside his Panther, using his folded field jacket as a pillow. Around him, the clearing was quiet, except for the low voices of crews performing maintenance and the distant rumble of artillery. The December sky was overcast and gray, heavy with the promise of snow. He closed his eyes, seeking a few hours of sleep before they had to move again. But sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept returning to that knocked-out Sherman, those 5 American bodies and what they represented. He thought about the crews in those tanks he'd been watching earlier, 5 men who could share the burden of operations, who'd been trained to keep each other alive, who served in a system designed to value their survival at least as much as it valued mechanical efficiency. He thought about his own crew. Weber, too young and undertrained. Schultz, fighting through pain that should have gotten him evacuated to a field hospital. Hartmann so exhausted that his hands trembled even when he wasn't driving. Meissner competent but worn down by 2 years of continuous combat. 5 specialists locked into rigid roles, each man carrying burdens he couldn't share. The whole crew operating on the ragged edge of effectiveness because there was no redundancy, no backup, no capacity to distribute the load. And he thought about the broader strategic situation that this small tactical detail illuminated. Germany was fighting this war the way his Panther crew operated. Every component stressed to its maximum. No spare capacity. Brilliant when everything worked, but catastrophically vulnerable to disruption. One broken component could cripple the whole machine. And components were breaking everywhere. Fuel supplies, replacement pipelines, industrial production, transportation networks, all of it stretched beyond sustainable limits. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.